The discovery. Jake hadn't stepped foot in the old hangar for years. It stood on the edge of his farmland, a rusty monument to a past he'd long left behind. The paint on the doors was peeling, and weeds had overtaken the cracks in the concrete floor, but something had changed recently. For days, his old equipment had been picking up strange power surges from this very spot. Curious, and a little uneasy, he finally decided to check it out. The evening was quiet as Jake approached the hangar. The cool breeze rustled the dry grass, and the faint hum of crickets filled the air. Pulling the heavy metal doors open, he stepped into the shadowy space. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the faint light streaming through small windows. His footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the hangar, passing by old tools, dismantled machinery, and a tarp-covered spacecraft he hadn't flown in years. Jake paused. Something felt off. The air inside was warmer than it should have been. A faint, barely audible hum seemed to pulse from somewhere in the hangar, and he noticed something strange, a faint glow from the far corner. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on his belt. He clicked it on and followed the glow, his heart pounding harder with every step. The footprints on the dusty floor stopped him cold. Small, delicate footprints, definitely not human. They led to an old storage compartment near the back wall. Jake crouched, scanning the area. The compartment door, which hadn't been opened in years, now hung slightly ajar. He hesitated. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Could it be an animal? The thief? Something else entirely? He reached out, gripping the edge of the door. Slowly, he pulled it open. There she was. Huddled inside, glowing faintly in the dim light, was a girl, no older than a teenager by the looks of her. But she was no ordinary girl. Her skin shimmered with a faint silver hue, and her eyes, large and deep green, seemed to glow softly, reflecting the light from his flashlight. She clutched a strange metallic device against her chest, trembling as she stared at him. Jake froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Was she an alien? Before he could speak, the girl flinched and muttered something in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was soft but urgent, like a whisper carried on the wind. Jake shook his head. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl didn't relax. Instead, she pressed herself deeper into the compartment, clutching the device tighter. Jake noticed a small cut on her arm, glowing faintly like her skin. She was injured. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice softer now. "This place has been empty for years." To his surprise, she seemed to understand him, or at least part of what he said. Her glowing eyes darted around, and she whispered again, this time in broken English. "Safe, hiding, danger." Jake's stomach tightened. Hiding from what? What kind of danger? He glanced at the device in her hands. It looked like nothing he'd ever seen before. Sleek, metallic, and covered in faintly glowing symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. Whatever it was important. The girl suddenly winced, her breathing growing heavier. She tried to speak, but her words came out jumbled. Jake noticed her body trembling, as if she were exhausted or in pain. All right, he said, lowering his voice to a soothing tone. "Look, I don't know who you are or what's going on, but you need help. You're hurt." He reached out slowly, trying not to scare her. She flinched but didn't pull away as he gently touched her shoulder. Her skin was warm and felt almost electric. "What's your name?" he asked, hoping to build some kind of connection. She hesitated, her glowing eyes locking onto his. After a long pause, she whispered, "Xyra." "Xyra," Jake repeated, nodding. "All right, Xyra. Let's get you out of there and figure this out, okay?" Xyra hesitated but finally shifted, allowing him to help her out of the cramped compartment. She was lighter than he expected, and her movements were cautious, like a cornered animal unsure whether to trust him. As Jake helped her to her feet, the hum he'd noticed earlier grew louder. He looked around, confused, until he realized it was coming from the device in her hands. "What is that thing?" he asked, but Shira shook her head, fear flashing across her face. Before he could ask more, a sudden noise outside the hangar made them both freeze. A low, rumbling sound, like a distant engine, growing closer. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Are they after you?" he whispered, and Tyra nodded, her eyes wide with terror. Jake didn't need to hear more. Grabbing her hand, he led her toward his old spacecraft. "Let's hope this old bird still flies," he muttered under his breath. As the rumble outside grew louder, Jake's mind raced. Who, or what, was coming for her? And what had he just gotten himself into? The escape. The sound of the approaching engines grew louder, rumbling like an ominous storm on the horizon. Jake glanced at Syra, her glowing green eyes wide with fear, clutching the strange device as if her life depended on it. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing outside. The hangar doors rattled as if something massive had landed just beyond them. A harsh, metallic screech cut through the air, followed by a deep, guttural hum. Jake's gut churned. Whatever was out there wasn't friendly, and it wasn't human. He led Syra toward his old spacecraft, a relic of his piloting days, gathering dust under a tarp. The ship was a sleek, battered beauty, a mix of military-grade tech and personal modifications, long forgotten but not entirely useless. "Let's hope this thing still has some life in her," Jake muttered, pulling off the tarp and revealing the faded silver hull. Zyra stared at the ship, her expression shifting from fear to faint hope. She touched the side of the craft, her glowing fingers leaving faint trails of light against the metal. Jake climbed inside, powering up the controls. The dashboard lit up with a weak glow, flickering as if the ship itself were waking from a deep sleep. A low hum filled the cockpit, and the engines sputtered to life. "Come on, baby. Don't give up on me now," Jake muttered under his breath, slamming switches and pushing levers. Zyra climbed into the co-pilot's seat, clutching the device tightly. Jake spared her a glance. "Buckle up. This might get rough." Suddenly, a deafening crash shook the hangar. The doors buckled inward, and a blinding light flooded the space. Jake squinted, shielding his eyes. Shadows moved within the light, tall, imposing figures with sleek armor and glowing red visors. "Found her," one of them growled, their voice distorted by a mechanical filter. "Not on my watch," Jake said, slamming the throttle forward. The spacecraft lurched, engines roaring to full power as it shot forward. The hangar doors exploded outward, debris flying in every direction. Jake gritted his teeth, gripping the controls as they burst into the open night sky. "Hold on," he shouted as the ship veered sharply upward. Behind them, the pursuing craft emerged, sleek and menacing. Their engines burned bright, closing the distance faster than Jake anticipated. He cursed under his breath, pushing the ship harder than it was built to go. "They're gaining on us," Zyra said, her voice trembling. "Yeah, I noticed," Jake replied, his eyes darting to the radar. 2 enemy ships were locked onto them, their weapons systems primed. "Can that thing do anything useful?" he asked, nodding toward the device in Zyra's hands. Zyra hesitated before placing the device on the console. The symbols on its surface began to shift, glowing brighter. She muttered something in her native tongue, her fingers moving over the controls with an expertise that surprised Jake. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping one eye on the pursuing ships. "Helping," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension. The device emitted a low hum, and suddenly, a wave of energy pulsed outward from their ship. The pursuing craft wavered, their engines sputtering as the pulse disrupted their systems. "Yes," Jake shouted as the enemy ships fell back, struggling to maintain power. But the victory was short-lived. A third ship appeared on the radar, larger and more dangerous than the first 2. Its silhouette loomed against the stars, bristling with weapons. "Great," Jake muttered. They brought the big guns. The massive ship fired, and a surge of red plasma streaked toward them. Jake yanked the controls, sending their craft into a sharp dive. The plasma shot missed by inches, the heat searing past them. "Zaira, whatever you're doing, do it faster," Jake barked. Zaira closed her eyes, her hands glowing as she touched the device. The ship's controls lit up brighter, and a holographic display appeared on the windshield, showing a cluster of nearby asteroids. "Head there," Zaira said, pointing to the asteroid field. Jake didn't question her. He adjusted their course, diving into the field at breakneck speed. The enemy ship followed, its massive frame struggling to navigate the dense cluster of rocks. Jake weaved through the asteroids with practiced skill, each turn a gamble against destruction. The smaller enemy ships reappeared, using their agility to their advantage. But Zaira's device continued to emit pulses, disrupting their systems enough to keep them at bay. "Hang on," Jake shouted, pushing the ship into a narrow gap between two massive rocks. The hull scraped against the stone, but they made it through. Behind them, one of the pursuing ships wasn't so lucky. It slammed into an asteroid, exploding in a bright flash. "One down," Jake muttered. The larger enemy ship fired again, a volley of plasma bolts lighting up the field. Jake swerved, dodging the blasts as best he could. "We can't keep this up," he said. Zaira's fingers danced over the device, and suddenly, a new energy field enveloped their ship. The hull glowed faintly, and the controls felt more responsive. "This should help," she said. Jake grinned despite the chaos. "Now you're talking." With the enhanced controls, Jake maneuvered the ship with precision, leading the remaining enemy ships deeper into the asteroid field. The large ship couldn't keep up, its bulk too unwieldy for the tight spaces. As they broke free from the field, Jake glanced at Zaira. "You've got some serious tricks up your sleeve, kid." Zaira managed a faint smile, but her expression remained serious. "They'll come back. They always do." Jake sighed, staring at the vast expanse of space ahead. "Then we'll be ready. For now, let's put as much distance as we can between us and them." The ship hummed steadily as they disappeared into the stars, the enemy ships left behind. For now. The pursuit. The silence of space was deceptive. It offered no respite, no safety, not when you were being hunted. Jake adjusted the ship's controls, his fingers dancing over the console as Zaira sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, clutching the device that seemed to attract trouble like a beacon. The ship's engines purred steadily now, their earlier struggles soothed by Zaira's mysterious enhancements. Jake stole a glance at her. She sat rigid, her glowing green eyes scanning the radar for any sign of their pursuers. She had been quiet for most of the flight, but her grip on the device told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't over. "They'll find us again," Zaira said softly, breaking the silence. Jake frowned. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "They always find me," she replied, her voice tinged with resignation. Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You keep saying they, but I don't even know who they are. Who are these guys? Why are they after you?" Zaira hesitated, her fingers brushing the glowing symbols on the device. "They're called the Harbingers. Mercenaries, bounty hunters, soldiers. They're all the same. They work for the Syndicate." "The Syndicate?" Jake asked, his brow furrowing. "A group of warlords," Zaira explained. "They destroy planets, enslave species, and use advanced weapons to keep their power. This," she held up the device, "is what they want. It's the key to their most dangerous weapon." Jake stared at the device. "A weapon? What kind of weapon are we talking about here?" Zaira's expression darkened. "A cosmic annihilator. It can destroy entire planets with a single strike. My people built this device to disable it, but the Syndicate attacked us before we could use it. I'm the only one left." Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So let me get this straight. You're carrying the only thing that can stop this superweapon, and these Harbinger guys will stop at nothing to get it. Zyra nodded. If they get it, they'll use it to destroy anyone who opposes them. Fantastic, Jake muttered, leaning forward and tapping the radar screen. Well, guess what? We've got company again. The radar lit up with red blips, growing closer with every second. Jake's jaw tightened as he adjusted their course, steering the ship toward a nearby star system. They're persistent, I'll give them that, he said, flicking switches to boost the ship's speed. Zyra leaned forward, her glowing fingers brushing the console. There's a debris field near the second planet in that system. We can lose them there. Jake raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Flying through a debris field isn't exactly a picnic. It's our best chance, Zyra said firmly. Jake nodded, trusting her instincts. He adjusted the trajectory and pushed the engines harder, the ship surging forward. The radar continued to blink ominously as the enemy ships closed in, their sleek, menacing forms cutting through the void. As they entered the debris field, Jake's breath caught. The remnants of a long-forgotten battle floated aimlessly in space, broken ships, twisted metal, and shattered satellites. It was a graveyard, and it would either be their salvation or their doom. Hold on, Jake said, gripping the controls tightly. The ship wove through the debris, dodging massive chunks of wreckage. Behind them, the Harbingers followed, their ships smaller and more agile, but the debris slowed their approach. They're still coming, Zyra said, her voice tense. Not for long, Jake replied, scanning the field for an opportunity. His chance came when he spotted a massive derelict cruiser, its hull still intact but teetering on the edge of collapse. He adjusted their course, guiding the ship dangerously close to the cruiser's remains. What are you doing? Zyra asked, her voice rising. Trust me, Jake said, smirking. As they passed the cruiser, Jake fired a series of blasts from the ship's rear cannons. The blasts hit the cruiser's weakened hull, causing it to shudder and collapse. Massive chunks of metal tumbled into the debris field, creating a chaotic chain reaction. The pursuing ships scrambled to avoid the falling wreckage, but one wasn't fast enough. A large piece of the cruiser's hull smashed into it, sending it spiraling out of control before it exploded in a fiery burst. One down, Jake muttered, guiding the ship deeper into the field. The remaining Harbinger ships were relentless, their weapons lighting up the darkness. Plasma bolts zipped past them, narrowly missing their hull. Zyra, can that device do something to even the odds here? Jake asked, his voice strained. Zyra hesitated, then placed the device on the console again. Her hands moved over its glowing symbols, and the ship hummed with newfound energy. Hang on, she said, her voice steady. A pulse of energy erupted from the ship, disrupting the Harbinger's targeting systems. Their plasma bolts went wide, and their ship struggled to maintain stability. Nice work, Jake said, a grin spreading across his face. The ship burst out of the debris field, leaving the Harbingers tangled in the chaos behind them. Jake adjusted their course, setting a trajectory toward a distant moon. We need to land and regroup, he said, glancing at Zyra. She nodded, her expression weary. This isn't over. They'll keep coming. Jake leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the stars ahead. Let them. We're not going down without a fight. As the ship disappeared into the void, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. Allies in the void. The moon they landed on was barren and unwelcoming, its surface a bleak expanse of jagged rocks and craters bathed in the faint glow of a distant star. Jake brought the ship down gently, the landing gear scraping against the uneven ground. He powered down the engines, the sudden silence amplifying the tension that hung between him and Zyra. This place looks like the universe's dumpster, Jake muttered, scanning the horizon. It's perfect, Zyra said, her voice firm. Remote, no settlements, and hard to track. We'll be safe here, for now. Jake unstrapped himself from the pilot's seat and stretched. "We could use a break. I don't know about you, but my nerves are shot." Zaira, still clutching the device, stood and followed him to the ship's hatch. As it hissed open, Jake stepped onto the rocky surface, the crunch of his boots breaking the eerie silence. The air was thin but breathable, and the faint hum of the ship's systems was the only sound in the desolate landscape. "Stay close," Jake said, scanning the area for any signs of life. Zaira nodded, her glowing eyes darting around. "We shouldn't linger outside for too long." As they moved toward a nearby outcropping of rocks, a faint shimmer caught Jake's eye. He froze, holding up a hand to stop Zaira. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice tense. Jake squinted. The shimmer moved, bending the light around it in a way that wasn't natural. Before he could react, the shimmer solidified, revealing a group of heavily armed figures stepping out of cloaking fields. Well, said the leader, a grizzled man with a mechanical arm and a jagged scar running across his face. "What do we have here?" "A pilot and his glowing friend." Jake instinctively stepped in front of Zaira, his hand hovering near the blaster strapped to his side. "We're just passing through. No trouble here." The leader smirked, his mechanical fingers tapping against a large rifle. "You picked the wrong moon to pass through. This is scavenger territory, and we don't take kindly to trespassers." Zaira clutched the device tighter, her glowing fingers trembling slightly. Jake glanced at her, then back at the group of scavengers. "We're not looking for a fight," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll leave, no harm done." The leader chuckled darkly. "Oh, you'll leave, all right. But not before you hand over whatever that shiny thing is." Jake's jaw tightened. Not happening. The scavenger leader raised an eyebrow. Brave words for a dead man. Before Jake could respond, Zaira stepped forward, her voice steadied despite the fear in her eyes. "It's not a weapon. It's a key to something dangerous. You don't want it." The leader laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, you have no idea what I want. Hand it over, or we take it." Jake's hand moved to his blaster, but before he could draw it, a shot rang out. The ground near his feet exploded in a shower of dust, and he looked up to see another scavenger aiming a rifle at them. "All right," Jake said, raising his hands. "Let's not do anything stupid." The scavenger leader stepped closer, reaching for the device. But before he could grab it, a low rumble echoed across the moon's surface. "What the hell was that?" one of the scavengers muttered. The rumble grew louder, and suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over them. Jake turned to see a heavily armed hovercraft cresting the horizon, its twin cannons trained on the scavengers. "Scatter!" the leader shouted, but it was too late. A blast from the hovercraft sent the scavengers diving for cover. Jake grabbed Zaira's arm, pulling her behind a rock as chaos erupted. The hovercraft landed with a thud, and a new group of figures emerged, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. "Friends of yours?" Jake asked Zaira, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No," she said, her eyes wide. One of the new arrivals, a tall woman with a cybernetic eye and a confident stride, approached them. She lowered her weapon slightly and smirked. "You've got guts, landing here," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "And you are?" Jake asked, his hand still on his blaster. "Call me Rhea," she said, "leader of what's left of the Iron Rebellion. And you're trespassing on my moon." "Great," Jake muttered. "Another welcoming committee." Rhea's cybernetic eye scanned Zaira, lingering on the device in her hands. "That's Syndicate tech," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "What's a couple of strays like you doing with something that dangerous?" Zaira hesitated, but Jake stepped in. "Long story. Short version. We're trying to stop the Syndicate from destroying everything in their path. And now, thanks to you, we're out of options." Rhea studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Lucky for you, I don't like the Syndicate much either. Maybe we can help each other." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Help? What's the catch? No catch, Rhea said. Just mutual survival. But if you're lying about your story. She let the threat hang in the air. Jake nodded. Deal. But you'd better be as good as you look, Rhea. The tension eased slightly as Rhea motioned for her team to stand down. Jake and Sarah followed them toward the hovercraft, the weight of their mission growing heavier with every step. For now, they had allies. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The betrayal. The makeshift rebel base was tucked deep beneath the jagged surface of the moon, hidden within a network of ancient lava tubes. As Jake and Sarah followed Rhea and her team through the dimly lit tunnels, Jake couldn't help but notice the uneasy silence between the rebels. Their eyes darted toward him and Sarah, filled with suspicion. And something else. Greed, maybe. Sarah stayed close to Jake, the glowing device clutched tightly against her chest. The soft hum it emitted was the only sound besides their footsteps. Jake leaned toward her and whispered, "Keep an eye on that one." He nodded toward Rhea, who was walking ahead of them, her cybernetic eye flickering faintly. "I don't trust her either." Tyra replied quietly, her voice barely audible. They entered a large cavern filled with scavenged equipment, from rusted weaponry to patched-up ships. Rebels bustled around, repairing gear and tending to wounds. It was a scene of desperation, but there was an undercurrent of determination in their movements. "This is where the magic happens," Rhea said, gesturing around. "Not much, but it's home." Jake glanced around, unimpressed. "Magic, huh? Looks more like a scrapyard." Rhea smirked. "You'd be surprised what we can do with scraps. Now let's talk about why you're really here." She motioned for them to sit at a makeshift table cobbled together from crates and metal panels. Jake and Sarah sat cautiously, while Rhea leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed. "That device," Rhea began, her tone sharp, "is worth more than you can imagine. If the Syndicate wants it, it must be powerful. So why don't you hand it over and let us deal with them?" Jake shook his head. "Not a chance. This thing is the only way to stop them. And it's not going to end up in the wrong hands. Yours included." Rhea's smirk faded. Her cybernetic eye whirred softly as it focused on Jake. "You think you can handle the Syndicate on your own? Do you even know what they're capable of?" "We've managed so far," Jake shot back, his tone defiant. Rhea studied him for a moment before turning to Sarah. "And you? You trust him with something this important?" Sarah hesitated but nodded. "Jake saved me. I trust him." Rhea's gaze lingered on Sarah, her expression unreadable. Finally, she pushed off the table. "All right, we'll help you, but if we're risking our lives, we need to know everything." Sarah looked to Jake, who gave a reluctant nod. She placed the device on the table, its glowing symbols casting faint shadows across their faces. "This is the only thing that can disable the Syndicate's weapon," Tyra explained. "It's designed to interface with their systems and shut them down. But it's also a beacon. That's how they keep finding us." Rhea's expression darkened. "So, as long as you have it, they'll keep coming." "Yes," Tyra admitted. "Great," Rhea muttered, pacing. "We're sitting ducks." Before anyone could respond, the cavern shook violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling as a deafening boom echoed through the tunnels. "They found us," a rebel shouted, rushing into the room. Rhea spun around, barking orders. "Get to your stations. Prepare for an assault." Jake grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the ship they had landed in. "Come on, we've got to get out of here." But as they reached the ship, they were surrounded by a group of rebels with weapons drawn. Rhea stepped forward, her cybernetic eye glowing ominously. "You're not going anywhere," she said coldly. "What the hell are you doing?" Jake demanded. Rhea's smirk returned, but it was colder now. "You think I didn't notice how valuable that device is? If we give it to the Syndicate, we might be able to broker a deal. Save ourselves." Jake's blood boiled. "You're insane." They'll kill you the second they get what they want. Maybe, Rhea said with a shrug. But maybe they won't. Either way, it's better odds than dying in this hole. The cavern shook again, the syndicate's assault growing closer. Jake's mind raced. They were outnumbered, and Rhea clearly wasn't bluffing. "Etc." Jake whispered, leaning close to her. "Can that thing do anything useful right now?" Syra's glowing eyes met his, and she nodded subtly. "I just need a moment." "Stall," she whispered. Jake straightened, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right, fine. Take it. But you have no idea how to use it." Rhea raised an eyebrow. "I'll figure it out." "No, you won't," Jake said, buying time. "That thing isn't some toy. It's alien tech. Without her, it's just a fancy paperweight." Rhea hesitated, glancing at Syra. "Is that true?" Syra nodded, her hands moving subtly over the device. Its glow began to intensify, but she kept her movements slow to avoid suspicion. The cavern shook again, this time harder. A distant explosion sent rebels scrambling, and the lights flickered. Rhea cursed under her breath. "We're running out of time." "Then let us help," Jake said. "We want the syndicate gone as much as you do." Before Rhea could respond, the device in Syra's hands emitted a blinding pulse of light. The rebels cried out, shielding their eyes, and Jake didn't waste a second. He grabbed Syra's arm and sprinted toward the ship, dodging the disoriented rebels. Behind them, Rhea screamed, "Stop them!" Jake and Syra dove into the cockpit, Jake firing up the engines as plasma shots whizzed past them. "Hold on," Jake shouted, slamming the throttle forward. The ship roared to life, lifting off just as the syndicate's forces breached the cavern. Jake guided the ship through the chaos, dodging debris and enemy fire. As they broke through the moon's atmosphere, Syra looked back at the smoldering surface. Her expression was heavy with guilt. "They're still down there," she said quietly. "They made their choice," Jake replied, his voice hard. The ship streaked into the void, leaving the chaos behind. But Jake knew this was far from over. The truth. The silence of space was deafening after the chaos they had just escaped. Jake leaned back in the pilot's chair, his hands gripping the controls tightly as if they were the only thing tethering him to reality. Syra sat beside him, her glowing eyes fixed on the stars ahead. The device rested on her lap, its symbols pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. "All right," Jake finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We need to talk. No more half-truths or vague answers. What aren't you telling me, Syra?" She didn't look at him. Her fingers traced the glowing lines on the device, her expression distant. "I've told you everything you need to know." "Bull," Jake snapped, his frustration boiling over. "We've been hunted across half the galaxy, betrayed by supposed allies, and barely escaped with our lives. If you expect me to keep risking everything, I need the whole story. No more secrets." Syra sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the universe rested on them. She looked at him, her green eyes shimmering with something Jake couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, or maybe guilt. "The device isn't just a key to disabling the syndicate's weapon," she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's more than that." Jake frowned. "More? What does that mean?" "It contains them," Syra said, gesturing to the device. "Them," Jake repeated, confused. Syra took a deep breath. "My people. When the syndicate attacked our planet, they didn't just destroy our cities or enslave us. They used their weapon to wipe us out entirely. Our bodies, our history, everything. But before it was too late, our scientists created this device. It's not just a tool, it's a vault. Inside it are the consciousnesses of the last survivors of my species." Jake stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. "You're telling me that thing has your entire civilization inside it?" Syra nodded. "Their memories, their knowledge, their voices. Everything that made us who we were. It's all that's left. Jake let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. No wonder the syndicate wants it. They're not just after a weapon. They're after the last piece of your people. Zyra's hands tightened around the device. If they get it, they'll destroy it. They don't want any trace of us left. Jake rubbed his face, processing the revelation. So what happens if we use it to disable their weapon? Does it destroy the device? Zyra hesitated, and that was all the answer Jake needed. Of course it does, he muttered. This isn't just about saving the galaxy. It's about sacrificing your people to do it. Zyra nodded, tears welling in her eyes. It's the only way. If the Syndicate's weapon isn't stopped, they'll destroy countless more planets, entire civilizations, just like mine. My people would want this. They'd want their legacy to mean something. Jake stared at her, his chest tightening. He'd been in tight spots before, faced impossible choices, but nothing like this. Before he could respond, the ship's alarms blared. Jake snapped his attention to the radar, where a cluster of red blips appeared, growing closer by the second. Looks like we've got company, he said grimly, flipping switches and adjusting the ship's trajectory. Zyra's eyes widened. How did they find us so quickly? Jake glanced at the device, its glow pulsing steadily. Your beacon. It's still active, isn't it? Zyra's face fell. I thought I deactivated it. Jake cursed under his breath. No time for regrets. Strap in. This is going to get messy. The Syndicate ships closed in fast, their sleek, angular designs cutting through the void like predators. Plasma bolts streaked past Jake's ship, shaking it violently. Jake's hands moved instinctively over the controls, weaving the ship through the barrage of fire. Zyra, can you do anything with that thing? Anything at all? Zyra placed the device on the console, her glowing fingers moving over its surface. Symbols shifted and brightened as the device emitted a low hum. I can create a temporary shield, but it won't last long. Do it, Jake said, pulling the ship into a sharp dive to avoid another barrage. Zyra activated the device, and a shimmering energy field enveloped the ship. The next wave of plasma fire dissipated against the shield, buying them precious seconds. Not bad, Jake said, his lips twitching into a small grin. Now let's see if we can turn this around. He pushed the ship's engines to their limit, weaving through an asteroid field to lose the pursuers. The Syndicate ships followed, their firepower relentless. Zyra's shield flickered, and she winced. It's failing. I can't hold it much longer. Jake spotted a derelict space station ahead, its skeletal remains orbiting a dying star. He adjusted their course, heading straight for it. What are you doing? Zyra asked, panic creeping into her voice. Improvising, Jake replied. The station loomed larger as they approached, its twisted metal structure casting long shadows against the star's dim light. Jake guided the ship into one of the station's docking bays, the engines sputtering as they powered down. We're sitting ducks in here, Zyra said, her voice trembling. Jake stood, grabbing a blaster from the ship's storage. Then we'd better not sit still. Come on. They hurried into the station, the eerie silence broken only by the creak of metal and the distant hum of the star. The Syndicate ships landed outside, and the sound of boots echoed through the station. Zyra gripped the device tightly as Jake led her through the labyrinth of corridors. They're going to find us, she whispered. Let them try, Jake said, his voice steady. We're not going down without a fight. The showdown. The derelict space station groaned and creaked like a dying beast, its metallic skeleton shuddering with every pulse of the dying star it orbited. Jake and Sarah moved cautiously through the dark corridors, the flicker of emergency lights casting eerie shadows. The device in Zyra's hands glowed faintly, its hum the only constant in the oppressive silence. Keep moving, Jake whispered, his blaster raised. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, for signs of their pursuers. They're already here, Zyra replied, her voice trembling. I can feel them." As if in response, the distant sound of boots on metal echoed through the station, growing louder. Jake cursed under his breath, motioning for Xyra to follow him into a nearby maintenance shaft. They ducked inside, the narrow space forcing them to crouch. "Do you have a plan?" Xyra asked, her glowing eyes locking onto his. Jake hesitated, then smirked. "I'm working on it." Xyra didn't look reassured, but she didn't argue. They crept through the shaft, the distant sounds of the Syndicate soldiers growing closer. Xyra's grip on the device tightened, her fingers trembling. Jake glanced back at her. "Whatever happens, don't let them take that thing," he said. "I won't," she replied, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. The shaft opened into a large chamber filled with the rusted remains of machinery. Jake scanned the area, noting the high vantage points and narrow pathways. It wasn't much, but it was something. "This will have to do," he said, leading Xyra to a concealed corner. "Stay here. I'll draw them away." "No," Xyra said, shaking her head. "I'm not hiding while you fight them alone." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You got a better idea." Xyra hesitated, then placed the device on the ground. Its symbols began to shift, and a holographic map of the station flickered into view. She pointed to a section marked by pulsing lights. "The station's core," she said. "If we overload it, the explosion will destroy the Syndicate forces, and the device with them." Jake stared at her. "You realize what you're saying, right? That's not just a weapon. It's your people." Xyra's expression was pained but resolute. "My people would want this. If we don't stop the Syndicate, no one else will." Jake ran a hand through his hair, glancing between Xyra and the map. "All right," he said finally. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it together." Xyra nodded, determination hardening her features. They moved quickly, following the map toward the station's core. The sounds of Syndicate forces closing in grew louder, and Jake's grip on his blaster tightened. As they reached the core, a massive cylindrical chamber filled with glowing energy conduits, their luck ran out. "Hold it right there," a cold voice commanded. Jake and Xyra turned to see the Syndicate leader step into the chamber, flanked by heavily armed soldiers. He was tall and imposing, his armor gleaming with dark energy. His eyes locked onto Xyra, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "So this is the last of the Zilani," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And the key to my victory." Jake stepped in front of Xyra, his blaster aimed at the leader. "You're not getting it." The leader laughed. "Brave words for a man outnumbered and outgunned. Hand over the device, and I might let you live." Jake smirked. "Not a chance." Without warning, he fired, the shot catching one of the soldiers in the chest. Chaos erupted as the Syndicate forces returned fire, plasma bolts zipping through the air. "Go," Jake shouted to Xyra, covering her as she ran toward the core. Xyra reached the main console, her glowing hands moving over its controls. The conduits around them began to pulse, the energy growing unstable. "Hurry up," Jake yelled, taking cover behind a support pillar as plasma fire scorched the walls around him. "I need more time." Xyra shouted back, her voice strained. The Syndicate leader advanced, deflecting Jake's shots with a shield of dark energy. "You can't win, pilot," he sneered. Jake gritted his teeth, ducking behind cover. "Watch me." Xyra's hands moved faster, the symbols on the device merging with the station's controls. The core's energy surged, the chamber shaking violently. "Almost there," Xyra cried. The Syndicate leader roared in frustration, raising a hand toward Xyra. Dark energy crackled around him, but before he could strike, Jake stepped out of cover, firing a barrage of shots. "Over here, you bastard," Jake shouted, drawing the leader's attention. The distraction worked. Xyra completed the sequence, and the core's energy reached critical levels. "It's done," she yelled. Jake sprinted toward her, grabbing her arm. "Time to go." They ran as the core began to overload, the energy conduits bursting one by one. Syndicate soldiers scrambled to escape, but the chamber was already collapsing. As Jake and Tyra reached their ship, the station behind them erupted in a blinding explosion. The shockwave propelled their ship forward, and Jake fought to keep it steady. When the chaos finally subsided, the station was gone, reduced to glowing debris. Jake leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily. "You okay?" he asked Syra. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's done. They're gone." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing. Your people would be proud." Syra looked out at the stars, her expression bittersweet. "I hope so." As the ship disappeared into the vast expanse of space, Jake knew one thing for certain. The Syndicate wasn't finished, but neither were they.